Hey guys, welcome. This is my full 10.11 TFT tier list with patch note analysis as well. We're going to go through all of the compositions that are going to be relevant on this update, and we're going to put a link in the description to all of those compositions below. It is sorted into a tier list. Now, the tier list might not be accurate. Sometimes I undervalue compositions and sometimes I overvalue certain compositions based on my personal experience. But what I would say is every composition that is in the description below can get you a top 4 finish when played correctly. There's been a lot of changes on 10.11, but not enough to shift the meta in a wild way that we get a new composition. Everything's pretty standard, if I'm completely honest with you. But the compositions are in the description below. I've sorted them into S tier and S plus tier discussed first, and at the end of the video we go all the way down to B tier. But overall, we're going to talk about every composition that is currently viable on this current update. There will be some variations that I haven't covered. Can't cover everything. I've just covered some of the basics, but it will help new players get to grips with the last 2 weeks of regular TFT before we have the mid-set update that comes on well, like 2 weeks away, patch 10.12. I'm going to be doing some theory crafting and some PBE videos over the next 2 weeks. But again, thank you so much for supporting the channel. It's really meant a lot. I've gained 10k subs since starting TFT, and you guys have all been amazing with your support. I will attempt to start streaming. I'll put the link to my Twitch channel in the description below. I'm looking to try and get that sorted by the time the mid-set update comes around, but what I will tell you is it's quite difficult with Rupert because he needs someone to look after him, and my wife works as well, so it's quite difficult. But I will try and find a time and stick to it, even if it's just a few hours, even if it's just 3 or 4 times a week. Try and get streaming in, because I think committing to it every day would just be too much for me. But yeah, let's cut my life story. Patch notes first, builds afterwards. Links in the description below. Go and check them out, and I will see you soon. Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be going through the patch notes, and then we're going to be going through a tier list of potential compositions for this update. I don't think a huge amount has changed from last update, but I've just shuffled a few things around. There are no wild new builds because of the changes on this update. This update is actually pretty simple in terms of what it's doing. So we're going to go through the update notes first, and then we're going to kind of go through those compositions. Thanks to G2A for sponsoring the channel. There is a reference link in the description below. Now, there's a new galaxy, Littler Legends. Everyone starts with 85 health instead of 100, and also the Little Legends are very, very fast. It's a very funny galaxy. I actually hate the idea of it though, because it basically means if you low roll or you're not aggressive, you're going to end up going out in a fast 8th. I like the fact that it changes playstyle. It changes your playstyle massively, but I also dislike it as a galaxy idea. It's just one of those galaxies that I just don't think rewards anything other than getting lucky. Like, if you don't get lucky, this galaxy is bad for you. Obviously, it rewards aggressive decision making, but you have to. Aggressive decision making goes along with sort of rolling the dice, right? You know, building an economy is safe because it allows you to, over a course of a game, have good odds of hitting what you need to get. If you have less HP and you have to play a more aggressive playstyle, you're basically rolling the dice as to whether you hit the units that you're after. It rewards adaptability, and it rewards aggressive rolling and aggressive leveling, but I just don't think it's a particularly fun galaxy to play. And they've changed the galaxy odds so that reflects that. Some traits that have been changed. Chrono is getting a slight buff. I don't know if this is enough to make 4 Chrono good. In fact, I would wager that it's not, to be honest with you. Most fights don't go on longer than 10 seconds in the late game. So you're essentially not even getting an extra tick out of that chrono. If the fight goes really long, and maybe you're going to get 1 extra tick out of that chrono, but I don't think it's good enough to make chrono relevant. I don't think this is going to change any builds hugely. It might make 4 chrono Kayle a bit better again, but I'm not totally convinced. Infiltrator now always jumps immediately at the beginning of combat rather than with a slight delay. The reason this is important is because it allows you to put melee units on the back line that will target infiltrators when they jump. Your ranged units, if they can fire at the enemy front line, they will not... Sorry, got a bit of biscuit in my throat. Bloody hell. Sorry, guys. Ranged units, if they can target the enemy front line, they will not target the infiltrators when they jump. They will still target the enemy front line. If the enemy front line is really far back, the ranged units will target the infiltrators when they jump. But if the enemy is, like, for instance, Mech Infiltrator, if you've got ranged units on the back line and they can reach the mech, they will still target the mech. I'm going to have to just stop recording. Okay, I had something stuck in my throat, and it was just like, you know, like really tickly, but it was just making me cough over and over again. Okay, let's talk about the champion changes. Caitlyn nerfed at 3-star, not relevant unless you're playing Hyperoll Caitlyn or Shredder, but honestly, that's still a lot of damage, and I still think she one-shots a lot of units in the late game. Graves gets nerfed at 1-star and 2-star, actually pretty relevant. Graves is a really overpowered unit in the early game, and he's now going to be less overpowered. Still good, but less overpowered. Jarvan getting a buff at level 1, which is useless because no one plays Jarvan at level 1 because he just dies. And he's getting nerfed at level 3, again a nerf to Shredder. Kha'Zix getting nerfed at 3 for isolation damage, or his spell damage. So this 100 spell damage nerf might not seem like a lot, but isolation triples it, so it's actually a 300 spell damage nerf. But I don't think Kha'Zix is going to be any worse off. You kind of play him for the RFC Infinity Edge Void rather than just the pure isolation damage. Xayah mana getting increased by about just about 40%, something like that. No, it's actually literally, yeah, it's literally 40%. Xayah mana getting increased by about 40%, which is relevant because it does mean that she's going to delay her attack speed steroid in Shredder. All of these buffs are nerfs mainly designed to deal with Hyperoll compositions, like the Kha'Zix composition and like the Xayah Shredder composition, of which I think Xayah will be weaker, but I still think Shredder is playable. Blitzcrank getting nerfed in the early game because he was pretty strong. He could basically one-shot level 1 units at level 1 himself. Lucian getting a buff at 3-star, but no one really plays 3-star Lucian, so I don't know how relevant this is. Maybe there is a potential 3-star Lucian build that you can play, but honestly, I don't really see it. Master Yi getting a slight attack speed buff might be enough to allow Bang Bros back into the meta, but I'll have to play it and see. And Cho'Gath getting a slight buff and Kayle getting a nerf. This Kayle nerf means almost nothing. Kayle is still really strong. And Cho'Gath getting a slight buff actually makes the traditional Brawler Blaster or variants of it very strong. So I'm interested to see this change. I think Cho'Gath really did struggle to get his ultimate off in fights, and this might help him a little bit. Last Whisper getting nerfed, again another nerf to an indirect buff to Vanguards, but another nerf to the Shredder composition as a whole. So that's all of the changes. In terms of what it means to the meta, Shredder will be playable but not as overpowered. Blitzcrank's not going to be as stupid in the early game. Maybe Bang Bros is able to come back in, and I think this pretty much cements Blaster Brawler as one of the best compositions in the meta right now. I still think snipers are going to be incredibly good. If you can backline some melee units, you can actually protect your snipers much better versus infiltrators, so snipers probably really strong. Backline positioning in general will be pretty strong in this update. Cool, let's jump into comps. So annoyingly, Mobilytics have introduced the new PBE champions to the team builder, which I think is good if you want to theory craft, but it's also annoying for me who wants to still do stuff relevant for the next 2 weeks. I will be doing some PBE content this week, by the way, guys. It will be coming out. I just haven't had a chance to log on to the PBE yet because I've been quite busy today, but I will get some content out. I'm really excited to theory craft builds. I've been hearing a lot. I've been hearing that Urgot is broken. I'm pretty excited to see how it goes. There's massive, they're diluting the legendary pool hugely as well coming into this next update. So your legendaries might be a little bit harder to hit. Let's talk about S tier builds then, and we'll start off with Blaster Brawler. Now, I'm going to show you the one variation that I really like, and then we can talk a little bit about other variations, but I'm not going to go into too much detail. There are 2 variations of Blaster Brawler that I think are really strong right now, and with the Cho'Gath buff, I think that there is a Mystic Brawler Rebel variation that I think is probably going to be quite strong on this particular update. So let's talk about that. I'm not going to go through early mid-game. We don't have time. We're going to quickly jump into that build and talk about it. So first up is the variation of Blaster Brawler that includes Soraka. There are some changes that you can make to this, but this is the build that you'll often find yourself in the mid-game. I think the variation of items that are really good on Jinx right now is Trap Claw, Deathblade, and Runan's Hurricane. Runan's Hurricane Deathblade is just a super strong combination. The reason I like this build is you get Mystic, you get the Soraka healing, which is super strong, you get the Rebel bonus for Jinx from the Malphite, you have Blitzcrank who can pull a target in for Jinx to be able to kill more quickly, Cho'Gath now ults more quickly, so you can put him front and center to provide some CC. You have Ezreal for the Chrono buff, which you give red buff to, he gives red buff to deliver that. And then you have the Vi, who can lock down a single target. Some changes that you can make are Lulu for Soraka and Misfortune for Ezreal. If you're going to bring in Misfortune, it might be a nice idea to then bring in Thresh for the chrono bonus, or Wukong for the chrono bonus, an extra CC. You could also replace the Soraka for Lulu, and then replace the Ezreal for Misfortune, and then bring in a Kassadin to bring a Celestial bonus in as well. So there are lots of changes that you can make, but this is a good template to work from. The other variation of Blaster Brawler that I think is very good, which I'll just show you now, is a little bit more reliant on high rolling, but you've probably seen me play it a few times on the channel, so I'm going to go over it quickly too. This is the second version of the Kayle composition that I like. It is the Sniper Kayle composition. You might not be able to get the perfect items for both Jhin and Kayle, but you can actually balance the items between them. Sometimes in the mid game, it's okay to have 2 items on Kayle and 2 items on Jhin, for instance. Some people like to run Jace over Misfortune for an extra frontline to make your Wukong a bit tankier. I don't think it really matters. I personally just like having the extra damage from Misfortune. What I would say is if you've got a Jace 2, keep the Jace 2 in. If you find a Misfortune 2, you can either go to 9 and put her in, or you can just take her out for the Jace because her damage is probably worth it. So that's the 2 versions of the Kayle compositions that I like, and I think they're going to be still pretty strong on this update. So you've probably seen this on the channel a few times. This is a super strong late game build that revolves around the demolition bonus for Gangplank, providing a lot of CC. And then you just have things like the Mana Reaver of the Kassadin. You have the Celestial, which should be included because there should be a Lulu. Yeah, you have the Celestial of Lulu in there as well. So you get the Mystic and Celestial from Lulu and Sona. You have all of these units together, and it just becomes a very, very strong overall. The main takeaway for Blaster Brawler is 4 blasters is overrated. 2 blasters is best because it gives you a lot more flexibility, and you don't need 4 blasters to really take over a fight. 4 brawlers is still incredibly good, but you can be more flexible with your brawler blaster builds. These are the 2 variants that I really, really like those, so we'll put those in the description. Next up is Kayle Carry, who is still very strong, and there are 2 versions of the Kayle Carry composition that I want to talk about. This version focuses on Lulu and Karma as mystics, and then you have the MF for the Valkyrie bonus. You have a front line that consists of the units that you see above. In terms of extra itemization, you want to give any items like QSS or Rabadons over to your Misfortune. Your Irelia can basically take any other damage items that you get. I just put Thief's Gloves on her a lot of the time if I get them, but otherwise things like, you know, the normal stuff like Infinity Edge, Deathblade, Last Whisper, etc. And I really like a redemption in this composition as well on Shen a lot of the time, because it really does come in useful. So this is the first variation of Kayle Carry. Do think it's very strong. In terms of perfect items, Ginsu's Rapid Fire and GA I think are the best items for Kayle, but Kayle's items can be flexible as well, so try not to get too bogged down in terms of getting the perfect items and just really work with Ginsu's as a core. Rapid Fire just means you can backline her, but if you don't have Rapid Fire, you can move her up to the front line a bit more effectively, and make sure that she's positioned and surrounded by the right types of units. And you don't have to have her on the backline if you don't have Rapid Fire, so you can move the Kayle around if you need to. So I really like this version of the Kayle composition. There is one other version that I really like as well. So this is the Kha'Zix build, or the K6 Hyperoll build. This is still super good. Cho'Gath got a buff, even though Kha'Zix got a nerf and Infiltrators got changed so that they can now be targeted when they jump to the backline. I still think this build is strong. Worth noting, you need to Hyperoll for at least Malphite and Kha'Zix. Twisted Fate 3 is nice, but not required. And then you need to go to look for level 8 to find Cho'Gath and Vel'Koz. Vel'Koz 2 with a Xerath and a Quicksilver is really nice if you can find any kind of AP item on him, like Rabadons, Morellos, Jeweled Gauntlet, anything like that is really good. One thing to note, you want your Blitzcrank to be on the opposite side to your Kha'Zix. This is basically going to allow Blitzcrank to pull something from the side of the board that Kha'Zix is jumping to. A lot of the times this will let Kha'Zix isolate a target. Otherwise, if there's only one target on that side of the board, just be aware that you need to scout that Kha'Zix might want to come onto this side so that you can jump to the board that Blitzcrank isn't pulling from. Or you put Blitzcrank on the other side to pull from the other side of the board. Just make sure that the Blitzcrank, if there are 2 units on the opposite side and you want to isolate one of them, Kha'Zix will jump when Blitzcrank pulls the other. Otherwise, make sure that the Blitzcrank pulls that target in and Kha'Zix jumps to the other side of the board, because there's nothing more useless than the Kha'Zix jumping to the side of the board when something has been pulled and there is now nothing for him to kill. But this build's really good. It's a Hyperoll at 3-1. And just look for the Kha'Zix. I think GA is pretty necessary now because of the targeting changes with Infiltrators, Kha'Zix is more likely to die. So it's good to have GA because that will help him reset and continue to threaten the backline. So that's that build. The comp that never goes away. And actually, interestingly enough, because backline positioning has become more popular, this comp's going to get a bit better, mainly because Kai'Sa's going to get more effectiveness out of her Morellos and out of a Demolitionist charge. What I would say is the same rules apply for this composition. You need to 3-star everything, you need to have the perfect items for mech, and Demolitionist is going to be more consistent for you to get a top 3 spot. This build is good, and it still will continue to be good. It hasn't had any nerfs or changes apart from the Kha'Zix isolation damage, which won't make too much of a difference because you never really relied on that anyway. But overall, this build is still going to remain similar. Items for mech, you need a QSS and you need a Bramble Vest. Then you can either go for Titan's Resolve or Trapclaw. I quite like Trapclaw. A lot of people do now like Trapclaw. They're favouring the dodge with the QSS over anything else. And I think Demolitionist charge is an absolute priority for Kayle, but Morellos really needed. If you don't find Xeraths, Shojin's is just as good as well. Shojin's is actually really good. But this build, even though the infiltrators got changed so they could actually be hit, they actually get to the backline more quickly as well. So it actually swings and roundabouts with infiltrators. They get to the backline more quickly, which allows them to deal damage more quickly, but also it does mean they can get targeted. But if you have Kayle, the more people surrounding her with demo charge, the better. So this build actually got ninja buffed on this update. So Mech Infiltrator is actually really quite decent again. Plus they nerfed Last Whisper. So getting through the Bramble Vest is going to be harder and going to be more difficult if you have the Bramble Vest on that mech now. So this build actually got slightly stronger on this update. This is an interesting one because I don't really know where to put it in terms of meta. Solar Gasang calls it S tier, but I haven't played it enough to really be able to tell you. So I'm going to put it in A tier or A+ tier because people do have a lot of respect for it. This is basically a Hyperoll Caitlyn build where you get Celestial Protector, there's a Star Guardian in there with the Soraka, you get Mystic, eventually I think you can add Lulu in, and you have Sorcerer with the TF and the Zoe. It all revolves around Caitlyn having Deathblade and Runan's Hurricane rather than that. Where's the Runan's Hurricane? There. Deathblade and Runan's Hurricane. And you do this instead of Jhin, for instance. Now, Caitlyn did get nerfed at 3, but it's not really about her ability damage. It's more about her straight-up attack damage. And then you have Neeko and Jarvan for your front line. And then you have things like Rakan, Soraka, Zoe, Ashe for all the CC and stuff like that. So it's a very interesting build. I recommend that you test it out. I'm not so sure how it performs, but I think it's actually going to be pretty solid. You know, Caitlyn is still a really, really good carry. You have the Chrono bonus in there. You have Sorcerer. You have Sniper, Celestial Protector, Star Guardian. Lots of stuff in there to make this build really good. But obviously you're competing with Shredder for things like the Jarvan, and you're competing, and the Caitlyn, and you're competing with Candyland for things like the Zoe and the Twisted Fate. So just be a little bit careful that you don't lose too many of those units early on. But I'm going to put it in A tier for the time being. It could be better than that. I'm just not sure. I haven't played enough of it, but I'm going to try and play it this week and let you know how it goes. Now, this is the traditional version of Korean Jhin. This is the version with Gangplank and Rumble to give you the Demolitionist bonus and allow Gangplank to just get a huge AoE ultimate off. This is the version that I think is probably strongest, so this is going to be slightly higher up the tier list than the Xerath version, but this is a very, 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 very good build. If you can get it, it absolutely stomps. The weakness that it has is it can be weak to infiltrators, which is why I like to put the Thresh next to my Jhin and surround it with the Rumble. I like to put the Jace in the backline with the Ashe as well, just to try and protect my backline a bit more versus infiltrators. So this is the Korean Jhin, which I think's a very, very good build and will continue to be a good build on update or patch 10.11. So this is the Korean Jhin build that I've been playing. I personally really love it. This is the version with the 2-star Xerath. If you can't find 2-star Xerath, there is the other version of the Korean Jhin build, which I'll show you in a moment. But this is just basically the build that you've seen on my channel. It's the Sniper build that's worked out quite well. I would recommend having Thresh next to your Jhin at the back line, just because it's now easier to put stuff at the back to protect against infiltrators, which are one of this build's worst nightmares. So if there's lots of infiltrators in the lobby, this build can be quite difficult to make work. But Korean Jhin, or just classic carry snipers, really strong build in the current meta right now, so definitely would recommend it. Okay, this is the version of the Bomberman build. This is still super strong right now. This build is incredibly good. You have to hyper-roll for a 3-star Ziggs. You need double Xerath, so this build just doesn't become as strong in the mid-game to carry you through. But if you can get it, it's a super good build and will continue to be a very good build in this update. Rebels haven't been changed. Jinx hasn't been changed. In general, Master Yi got a slight buff. Master Yi and Yasuo are interchangeable with Aurelion Sol, although I'd say that Yasuo provides a little bit more utility, so Aurelion Sol is probably better coming in for Master Yi. But this build will still continue to be incredibly good if you get the right items. I think this build, if you get the right items, is S tier. The problem with it is that you need 4 tiers to make it work, so it's a little bit inconsistent, which is why I've put it a little bit further down on my tier list. I put it in A tier only because it requires 4 tiers. If you do not get 4 tiers, it is not flexible. Things like classic Blaster Brawler and some of the builds like Kayle that you've seen before are flexible on items because you don't need the perfect items to get a top 4. With this build, if you don't get double Xeraths, you're not in a good spot because you probably won't have enough of a win streak to build back up and get to level 8 and level 9 to find the Gangplank and Misfortune. So just be aware of that when you're playing this build. Interestingly enough, a build that's been popping up again with the popularity of Jhin has been Dark Stars. Jhin is good with Runan's Hurricane and Deathblade, so why is he just not good with, you know, sort of 6 Dark Stars to add to that? I mean, the healing with Celestial is obviously really important here. What I would say about Dark Star is for it to be really good in the late game, and this is a build that you can transition to from snipers, you need to have Xerath 2 to make this build work really well in the late game. So I will let you know that as a fact. Without Xerath 2, this build is going to really struggle. But it transitions nicely out of snipers. You can run Maud as a Vanguard in the mid game and then transition into the rest of the Dark Stars if you find the Xeraths. What I would say is this build is extremely reliant on you finding the Xeraths, and Xerath 2 is an absolute win condition. But if you find Xerath 2, this can be a top 1 build really easily. So this build has been creeping up in terms of power, and I think will be pretty good on this update as well. My trusty Space Jam. This is Space Jam, but with the Sniper added, which I think provides another excellent form of damage for this build. The problem with Space Jam right now is that you don't have enough time usually to 3-star all the relevant units. Jace is a bit more contested than he usually was. Kassadin is more contested than he usually was. And Rakan and Shredder sometimes pops up from time to time. So, and also Jhin is now more contested too. So the problem with this build is that sometimes you just can't get the 3 stars necessary to get to the late game. There are lots of discussions about what is good on Darius in terms of items, but what I will say as a flat choice is that Rabadon's Jeweled Gauntlet plus Infinity Edge or Ionic Spark with Darius himself is all really good. So Darius is still good, like just as long as you put big AP items on him. Rabadon's or the Jeweled Gauntlet Infinity Edge combo is really nice as well. So you can go with anything. But Space Jam is good, don't get me wrong, but the only problem with it is that sometimes you bleed out too much by the time that you get relevant, and really you need to luck into like a Jace 3 to really make this build have legs in the late game. If you don't luck into a Jace 3, it can be very difficult to make this build work. So I think it can be a solid top 3, top 4 if you get the right 3 stars, especially Darius, especially Rakan. His CC is really helpful, but it can be quite difficult if you're like stage 4 and you just don't have or stage 4, stage 5, and you don't have the relevant 3 stars. This build can be a real pain in the butt to make work. So I don't think it's a super highly rated competition, but I do think it's good, especially if you get a lot of AP items to start off with and you're not comfortable going into a sorcerer build. Okay, let's talk about Rebels. I almost forgot this one. This is the last one I'm actually recording. Rebels, I think this is the strongest variation. If you can get demo spat on Aurelion Sol, don't worry about dropping Ziggs. If you find the demo spat, yeah, okay, you can put Malphite in for a bit of more of a front line, but honestly, the demo spat Aurelion Sol does all the work that you need. GP will need GA, but you can put any AP items on him. Otherwise, MF, if she's going in the corner, should have a QSS so she doesn't get hooked. And because this is 6 Rebels, I don't actually believe Jinx needs a defensive item. You can put Trap Claw on her, but I don't think you need QSS or GA. I think Red Buff, Runans, and Deathblade is the best combination for Jinx in this particular instance. Because she has Sona to cleanse stuns. If you want to put a defensive item on her, that's okay though. But yeah, this is the version of Rebels that I think is the strongest right now. Feel free to use it. It can be a little bit hard to make work in the late game. The positioning can sometimes be a little bit suspect because you have to group everybody together, and that means that you're kind of weak to things like Sorcerers and Mech, as well as obviously the demo spat Kai'Sa, which can sort of tear you apart. But the shielding sometimes makes up for that. So, you know, Rebels are still pretty good if you can get the 2-star Aurelion Sol and the 2-star Gangplank especially. Very, very, very good. Very good. So unironically, I think Candyland is slightly better than Shredder this update, mainly because the Last Whisper nerf means that Poppy survives longer and she doesn't get killed instantly by a lot of these players running the Shredder composition. So I think, like, genuinely, Candyland is pretty strong if you get the right items for it, and it can be a very, very good build to get you a solid top 4 placing. I do think Candyland's going to be a lot better on this update, and Vanguards in general will be a lot better on this update, mainly just due to the fact that the Last Whisper got nerfed and Shredder is not as popular. Don't get me wrong, Shredder still works, but it's just not as super strong as it previously was. I think Shredder now is better off played with Hurricane and Deathblade rather than just straight up going like Last Whisper, for instance. So I think you're probably going to see people playing the Hurricane Deathblade variant of Shredder a bit more. But I think Candyland, which is this build here, you Hyperoll at 3-1 for Poppy, Zoe, and Twisted Fate. Then you go up to level 8. And this build can also transition into Gangplank pretty nicely if you find a GA. So if you want to sell your Poppy because you don't get a 3-star, you can sell it off and get a Guardian Angel instead and go for 6 Sorcerer Gangplank, which can work really well. But I genuinely think Candyland is going to be a bit better on this update, mainly because the Last Whisper nerfs means that Poppy survives a bit longer, and also because there aren't a ridiculous amount of Shredder players in the mid game. Usually you'd see like 2 or 3 Shredder players in one game, and so Poppy would just get murdered, like absolutely murdered in the mid game. Also, you've got to be aware that Vel'Koz is a pretty integral part of this composition, and he gets contested a lot for Void Brawler, so you might not always find Vel'Koz 2, which does limit some of the damage output that this comp has in the late game. But yeah, Candyland's good. So 6 Cybernetics, they really suck. I'm sorry guys, 6 Cybernetics really do suck most of the time. They're not in a good spot right now, but if you do find yourself playing them, don't get baited by the Kayle version. I do actually think that things like the Kassadin and Xayah version, so you get Celestial plus Mana Reaver in there, is better. Or you can play Shen Ezreal, for instance, to give yourself the blaster bonus for Lucian, especially if you've got red buff, that might work out better. And it also gives you Chrono, which can help for Irelia early on. But I do think overall, this composition is a lot weaker than it used to be. Again, you're playing Irelia, you're stacking her with any kind of AD items that you can get. Remember, if there's lots of Bramble Vests or lots of Vanguards, you should be looking for a Last Whisper. But overall, this build is in a much weaker place than it used to be. Definitely not as good as it previously was. It's a very flexible positioning-wise as well. Irelia should be going onto a target that she can get a quick reset off, rather than getting someone that she's going up against someone that she's going to get stuck versus. Like, for instance, Mech is like this build's worst nightmare, because Irelia gets stuck on the Mech forever, then just dies. So just be aware that this build is not as good as it previously was, but if you do find yourself going into 6 Cybernetics, there are a couple of variations with the Kassadin and the Xayah, or with the Shen and the Ezreal, that do work okay and could probably net you a top 4 position. Ah yes, Shredder. Still a composition, still good, just not as good as it previously was. There are a couple of ways to play this, mainly revolving around the items that you want to put on Xayah. I would say that Deathblade is a really good item for her in general right now. It kind of makes up for maybe some of the lack of damage in the later stages when she loses her ultimate more quickly. But the decision is between Runan's Hurricane and Last Whisper. Last Whisper still very good, don't get me wrong, but Runan's Hurricane might give you a bit more consistent damage output in fights where there are lots of grouped up enemies and you want to kind of get a bit of AoE down. Other than that, nothing really changed in this composition. You're just looking to get Xerath, things onto Jarvan. Redemption is good on Shen or Jarvan. Redemption really good on Jarvan, obviously, as it scales with level. Morello's on Rakan. 3-star Rakan is really nice in this comp, and you're just running the same thing you were previously. This comp is not dead. Don't think that it is dead just because a couple of nerfs came through. Well, quite a few nerfs came through. It's still good. It's just not as dominant as it previously was, which I think Hyperoll compositions shouldn't be that dominant. I do genuinely feel like Hyperoll compositions need to be slightly weaker in the late game compared to someone getting some good units and good items for a late game comp. These comps should be really strong in the mid game and try and close you out in sort of stages 3 to 6. But once we get to stage 6 onwards, the late game comps should start to come online, and I think that's where the nerfs are going to start to hit Shredder a bit more. So this composition is still good. You can still play it. It's just not as good as it previously was.